Welcome back to Park Ranger File. Across Appalachia, there are small towns where certain events were never fully documented. People went missing, sightings were dismissed, and in some cases, entire areas were simply ignored afterward. Tonight, we're covering 15 of those cases. Before we start, if you're new here, subscribe right now and hit that notification bell. New content drops every single week, and you do not want to come in mid-season. Let's begin. Story 1, The Deer That Walked Like a Man. My name is Garrett Pulliam, and I spent 11 years driving long-haul freight routes through central Appalachia before I quit, and took a warehouse job in Roanoke. I want to be specific about that, because the reason I quit the route matters to this account. I didn't quit for the usual reasons. I didn't quit for the schedule or the money or the wear on my body. I quit because of what I saw on a particular stretch of two-lane highway in West Virginia. And because every time I drove that stretch after the night had happened, my hands shook on the wheel and I could feel my heart rate climbing before I even reached the section of road where it occurred. 4 years of that was enough. I'm telling this story now because I've been holding it for too long and it's starting to press on me in ways I'm not comfortable with. It was late October 2019. I was running a northbound load legal weight legal hours through a stretch of highway between Summersville and Webster Springs. If you've never been on that road, understand what I mean when I say remote. The cellular signal dies for 30 or 40 miles at a stretch. The trees press right up to the edge of the asphalt on both sides, dense second-growth timber that swallows up the ditches and the fence lines and any sense of what lies beyond the immediate corridor of the road. There are no streetlights. There are stretches where you can drive for 20 minutes without seeing another vehicle in either direction. I had driven that road maybe 60 times over my years on the route. I knew every curve and every grade change, every broken guardrail and every unmarked logging road, cutting off into the dark between the trees. I knew it the way you know your own house in the pitch black. Or I thought I did. It was around 2 a.m. I was alert. I want to be clear about that. I had slept that afternoon before the run. I was on a cup of coffee that was still warm in the cup holder. I had an AM talk show on low out of Charleston, and I was paying attention. I came around a long curve in the road, and my headlights swept across a field on the left side. A flat stretch of cleared land, maybe 100 yards deep, sitting at the base of a wooded hillside, the kind of pasture land you see scattered through that part of West Virginia, where someone at some point cleared the flat ground, but left the slopes in timber. And standing in that field, maybe 30 yards off the road, was a deer. At least that's what I told myself for maybe 10 seconds while I was looking at it. My foot came off the gas, which is the reflex you develop when you've been driving rural freight routes long enough. You see a deer at the road's edge, you get ready for it to bolt toward you. Standard thing. But as the headlights stayed on it and I slowed, the image started to not resolve the way a deer should resolve. The legs were wrong, and I don't mean slightly wrong. I don't mean a posture issue or a health problem in the animal. I mean dramatically, architecturally wrong. They were too long in proportion to the body, too long in absolute terms. And it was standing upright, not the way a deer stands naturally on 4 legs. Upright in the way that I am standing right now. Bipedal, vertical. Its upper limbs, what would have been 4 legs on a normal deer, were drawn in close to the body, tucked against the chest. Its neck was angled forward, and the head was pitched downward, and the antlers were there, a full rack, curving upward and outward in a way that my brain kept trying to use to lock the whole image into something recognizable. But the antlers were the only thing that looked right. Nothing else about this creature looked right. I slowed the truck almost to a stop. I know I shouldn't have. But the truck slowed and I reached for the cab spotlight, the one mounted to the driver's side door, and I cranked it on and turned it toward the field. And the thing reacted to the light. Not the way an animal reacts to a sudden bright source, not freezing or bolting or staring with that tapetum glow. It turned its body toward me, turned and faced me, fully squaring its shoulders toward the truck, the way a person would turn toward something that called their name. And in the spotlight, I could see the face. The head was a deer head. The skull shape, the long face, the ear positions. Deer. But the proportions were compressed, the snout shorter than it should have been, the cranium slightly more elevated and rounded, and the eyes were placed too far forward on the skull, facing forward the way a predator's eyes face, rather than the wide lateral placement of a prey animal. The eyes were forward-facing, tracking, seeing in the binocular way that hunters' eyes see. And the mouth was open, not wide open, just open. And I could see that the jaw had too many angles to it, the way the mandible hinged against the upper skull, suggesting a range of opening that was not consistent with any deer jaw structure I'd ever seen on a road-killed animal. It was built to open wider than it was currently showing me. And then it raised one of the upper limbs, extended it toward the truck. I want to say that word carefully because I know how it sounds, pointed at me. Not a random motion, not a reflexive gesture, deliberate. The limb came up and extended, and the angle of it was directly at the cab of my truck, and it held there, steady for maybe 3 seconds. My foot went to the floor. My body made the decision, and the truck responded, and I was doing 70 on that 2-lane inside of 5 seconds. I did not look in the mirrors. I did not turn off the spotlight. I drove until I hit the edges of Webster Springs, and then I pulled into the parking lot of a closed dollar store. And I sat there with the engine running and all the lights on and the doors locked, and I did not move for 45 minutes. A sheriff's deputy cruised through the lot around 3 in the morning and slowed to look at the truck. I waved at him from the cab. He drove on. I've never been more grateful for the presence of law enforcement in my life. I delivered the load. I took the alternate route for every return run after that. Added an hour to my drive time. Told dispatch it was a road closure. I did the same thing every time after. I quit the long haul work 8 months later. I told my wife it was the schedule. She believed me because she wanted to. I'm telling the truth here, to strangers for the first time. That thing in the field pointed at me. I don't know what that meant. I know that not knowing is better than knowing. I've spent 4 years making peace with not knowing. I'm almost there. Story 2. I teach high school history in a small town in eastern Kentucky. My name is Delia Crouch, and I am 43 years old, and I've spent my professional life training students to examine evidence carefully, to distinguish between what the sources actually say and what we want them to say, to resist the comfort of a narrative that fits too neatly. I have a practical evidence-based worldview, and I believe in it. I'm also going to tell you something that my practical evidence-based worldview has been completely unable to account for in the 6 years since it happened. The house was built in the late 1880s, a big 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch and good bones and 12 acres of hill country, backing up against a ridge in eastern Kentucky. My husband Dale and I bought it because we wanted space and history and a place our kids could grow up with room. We did our due diligence. The realtor disclosed, as she was required to, that there was an old hand-dug coal shaft mine in the ridge that backed the property. Pre-mechanization worked by the family that originally owned the land, abandoned when they ran out of viable seam, sealed up with a concrete block wall, mortared across the opening. She said our kids might enjoy exploring around the base of the ridge as a nature history experience. I thanked her for the disclosure and thought nothing more of it. We moved in July, me and Dale, and our 2 children, Colton, who was 15, and our daughter, Bree, who was 12. The first weeks were genuinely wonderful. The kids thrived on the space. We had a garden going, a creek at the back of the property where Colton spent his afternoons, and the evenings on that porch with the ridge behind the house going purple in the setting light were the best evenings of my adult life. And then Bree started sleepwalking. She had never done it before. Not once in 12 years. Dale found her the first time standing in the backyard at just past midnight, barefoot in her pajamas, facing the ridge. He said when he found her, she had her arms straight down at her sides. Her face pointed directly at the concrete block wall at the base of the ridge where the mine opening was, and she was completely still. He walked to her and touched her arm. She turned toward him and her eyes were open but not present, and she said something in a voice that was not entirely Bree's voice. He couldn't make out the words. He said they were not English, not any language he could identify. He brought her inside, and she woke in the hallway, confused and frightened, with no memory of the yard or the ridge or any of it. We chalked it up to the stress of the move. New house, new school, disrupted routines. We made an appointment with her pediatrician, who suggested the adjustment period. It happened again 3 nights later. I found her that time. Same spot, same posture, same fixed orientation toward the ridge. And as I crossed the last 20 yards toward her, the sound started, from behind the concrete wall, from inside the mine. It was breathing. The rhythm was the right rhythm, the cycle of intake and output, slow and very heavy, each breath on a count that was too long for a human rest cycle. Something taking its time, with each breath, something with lungs large enough that each intake lasted several seconds. And beneath the breathing, woven through it, a sound that I have struggled to describe to every person I've told this to. A voice but stripped of consonants, just the vowel components of speech, long rolling sounds that rose and fell in patterns too complex to be ambient noise and too repetitive to be random. A voice addressing someone, and I was carrying my 12-year-old daughter away from it and wondering if she'd been hearing it every night. I got Bree inside, woke Dale, told him everything. He just said we needed to make calls in the morning. We made them. A mine safety inspector from the state energy office arrived 3 days later, methodical and professional in a way I found very comforting right up until he came out of the mine. He was in there for about 20 minutes. When he came out, he was quieter than he had gone in. A specific kind of quiet, the quiet of a person who has decided not to react to something while they process it. He would not look at me when he spoke. He said the shaft was structurally compromised and would need to be properly sealed. He said there were some markings on the interior walls that he was going to report to the State Historical Commission. I asked what kind of markings. He said he would rather not say. I pressed him. He was quiet for a moment, and then he looked at me finally and said, "They're not mining notations." And then he put his clipboard under his arm and went to make a call on his radio. They came back a week later and sealed the mine properly with reinforced concrete and rebar. Bree stopped sleepwalking the same night the new seal went in. I asked Dale if he thought that was a coincidence. He said he didn't think anything was a coincidence anymore. I still live in that house. I still love it. But I've never let either of my children go near the base of that ridge. And sometimes on still nights, I go to the back bedroom window and I listen. Most nights there's nothing, but the nights when there's something, even from this distance, even through new concrete and rebar, I don't sleep well after. Whatever was breathing in that mine is still in that mine. The concrete just means it has to breathe in the dark. Story 3, the figure on Clingmans Dome. I've hiked extensively in the southern Appalachians for 15 years. My name is Theo Baxter. I live in Asheville and I'm 38 years old. I have logged somewhere north of 2,000 trail miles across the region. I'm telling you that context because I want you to understand that I'm not someone who mistakes a stump for a figure in the dark, or confuses bear sounds for something else, or gets disoriented by the backcountry. I know the environment well. What happened on my solo overnight in the Smokies in April of 2017 does not fit in any of my normal categories. I was doing a 2-day loop out of the Forney Creek trailhead, planning to camp on the ridge and then summit Clingmans Dome on the second morning. The first day was as good as early April in the Smokies gets, cold and crystalline, the trees not yet leafed out, so the views through the hardwood forest were long and clear in every direction. I made camp on the ridge around 4 in the afternoon, ate, read, and was in my sleeping bag well before dark. I slept deeply. What happened had nothing to do with half sleep or hypnagogic confusion. I was completely awake. The cold woke me. Not the expected cold of an April night at elevation. Something had changed in the air inside the tent itself. A drop that I felt in my sinuses and at the back of my throat. The kind of cold that your body identifies as wrong, rather than merely unpleasant. It was the cold of an active absence, as if something had been removed from the air near my tent, rather than the temperature simply dropping. Something had changed near me, and my body knew it before my conscious mind had processed any external information. Then I heard the footsteps, right outside the tent, not approaching from a distance. Right there, bipedal. I have a solid calibration for the maximum distance between footfalls of a walking human. These footsteps had a stride length at least half again, as far as the longest human stride I could imagine. Something with legs longer than any person I've ever encountered was walking upright alongside my tent, close enough that I could hear the compression of the dead leaves and needles under each foot, close enough that the outer fabric of the tent shifted slightly, with the movement of air displaced by something passing very near. I didn't move. I didn't reach for my headlamp or my bear spray. I lay still because everything in my body said that moving right then was the wrong choice. The footsteps came even with the tent, slowed and stopped, right alongside me. And then the forest went into that particular silence that every backcountry person knows. The silence that is not merely the absence of sound, but the suppression of it. The silence that tells you something is present and making no sound on purpose. For maybe 30 seconds there was nothing. And then something pressed against the tent wall. Slowly. The way you would test a surface if you wanted to understand it. And the shape it made against the nylon was unmistakable in the moonlight that filtered through the canopy. Fingers, 5 of them, a hand, pressed flat against the outside wall of the tent. The palm behind the fingers and the fingers extending down and splayed slightly in the way a hand splays when pressing into a surface and exploring it. The fingers were too long and too wide, but arranged in the human configuration. They were exploring the material, taking their time with it, learning it. The hand drew back. The footsteps resumed, heading upslope toward the ridge, taking that impossible stride, the sound getting fainter. I lay there until the sky began to gray, and then I packed in the remaining dark and was on the trail heading out before 6. I did not summit Clingmans Dome. I took the fastest route to the trailhead and sat in my car for a while before driving because my hands were not entirely steady. I still hike, but I have not camped alone in the Smokies since, and I don't think I'm going to. You can tell yourself a lot of things after the fact, and I've told myself most of them. But a branch in the wind doesn't leave the imprint of 5 fingers and a palm against the inside of a tent wall. And it doesn't lift a hand and press deliberately and then walk off into the dark. I know what I felt through that tent wall. I think about it more than I'd like to. Story 4. I worked 3 seasons as a volunteer trail crew in the Pisgah National Forest in western North Carolina. Chainsaw certified, drainage maintenance, blowdown clearing. My name is Lena Hardwick, and I was 26 when the first sighting happened. I am writing this because I've seen accounts on various forums that match what I've experienced closely enough that I feel obligated to add mine to the record. There is a woman in the Pisgah backcountry. I have seen her on 4 separate occasions over 2 years, 4 different trips, 4 different locations within the forest. No overlap in geography. The first time I was solo on the Art Loeb Trail, camped on a flat near a creek. I was eating dinner at dusk when I saw her across the creek, standing in the tree line, partially obscured by a large hemlock. A woman in a white dress that was entirely wrong for the terrain and weather. No pack, no gear, no shoes that I could see. Very tall, very pale, looking directly at me with an expression I can only describe as neutral, not vacant. Neutral. The way a person looks when they are observing something and have not yet decided what they think about it. I called out and asked if she was okay. She did not respond. I stood and started toward the creek, and she stepped backward into the trees deliberately. One step, two, and she was behind the foliage. I assumed a day hiker in inappropriate clothing who'd been spooked by the sight of a stranger in camp. I noted it and moved on. 8 months later, different section of the forest entirely, near the Black Mountain crest. Solo camp, early evening, a creek nearby. And there she was. Same distance from my camp, same white dress, same posture, same direct and neutral regard. This time I had my headlamp on of her. Before she could step back, and I put the beam directly on her face. And her face in the light was wrong, not deformed. Wrong in a way that was harder to articulate. Too symmetrical. Faces are not symmetrical in that way, not perfectly, and there's always some slight difference between the left side and the right that comes from a life lived and expressions made and emotions felt. Her face had no such difference. It had been arranged to look like a face rather than grown to be one. And she was smiling slightly, just the corners of her lips raised, and the smile didn't reach her eyes in any recognizable way. My headlamp dipped for half a second, a battery fluctuation, and when the beam came back, she was gone. The third time, I was on a crew, not solo. My crewmate Brian woke me at around midnight and said there was someone outside. I came out and he was pointing toward the tree line, and there she was. Third location in the forest, months after the previous sighting, same white dress, same pale skin, same watching posture. Brian said she'd been there at least 10 minutes before he woke me. We walked toward her together. When we were about 30 yards from her, she changed. Her head went down, her neck lowering, her shoulders rising in a way that was not a human posture of fear or submission. Something more like a display. And she made a sound. I felt it in my chest and behind my eyes, a low sustained frequency that registered in my body rather than my ears. The way you feel a subwoofer in a car. Brian and I both stopped walking at exactly the same moment without discussing it. And she lifted her head back up, and the expression was still neutral, and she was gone. Not walking. Gone. The fourth time was broad daylight, mid-afternoon sun. I was driving out on a fire road after a workday, and she was standing in the middle of the road ahead of my truck. White dress, pale skin, full afternoon light. No shadows to confuse anything. She looked at me through the windshield for approximately 5 seconds, and then walked into the tree line on the left side of the road. Walked. Normal pace. Into the trees. I sat there for a long time. Then I drove out. Whatever she is not a person. The forest knows her in a way it does not know us. I could feel that on every one of those 4 encounters. We were intruders in an arrangement that predated us. She was not. I think she was communicating something. I just don't know what she wanted us to understand. Before we continue, I want to check in with the community right now. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're from and whether you've experienced anything in the woods that you couldn't explain. This channel exists because of the community that shows up here and engages and shares. I read every single comment. Now, Story 5. I'm a fisheries biologist with 15 years of field experience in the mountain stream systems and high elevation lakes of the southern Appalachians. My name is Ron Gebhardt. I want to be upfront about my professional background because it determines how seriously I take my own observations and how carefully I've tried to account for alternative explanations. I have spent a long career being skeptical and methodical. I'm going to describe something that my skepticism and methodology have been unable to explain in 6 years of trying. I was conducting winter sampling on a high-elevation lake in the Roan Highlands area of Tennessee. January, well below freezing. The lake was partially frozen with a solid ice shelf extending about 40 feet out from the shoreline. Clear day, no wind. severe mountain winter clarity that makes the air feel like glass. My field partner Sandra had taken the first samples back to the truck, and I was working alone at the ice edge, using a hand auger to cut test holes for a water column temperature profile. Standard protocol, work I've done dozens of times. The ice was measuring around 6 inches solid, and I was working in a methodical and focused way. I had the probe lowered into the second of my planned holes and was watching the real-time temperature display when the sound started. And it came not from the water below the ice, or from the far shore, or from the surrounding forest. It came from within the ice itself, from that cavity space that forms between the underside of the ice and the water surface when lake levels fluctuate after freezing. I need to be precise about what I heard. The sound was a voice. I am a scientist, and I am making that statement as carefully as I can make any statement in my professional life. It was a voice. Not ice shift, not gas release from sediment, not any compression artifact from my equipment, not any of the ambient sounds a partially frozen lake produces. The tonal quality of it, the harmonic structure, the variation in pitch and pace, all of it corresponded to the pattern of a speaking voice in a way that no non-linguistic sound source I've encountered in the field has ever produced. I could not make out words. The register was too low for words, too resonant. But the cadence was speech. Something was speaking under the ice, and it was moving, tracking from my left to my right at roughly walking pace. I could follow it by ear. And as it passed beneath where I was standing, I felt something I will describe carefully because I want to be precise. I felt presence. The way your body knows a bear is near before your eyes find it. That somatic signal that tells you something large is very close. Something enormous was directly beneath my feet, on the other side of 6 inches of ice. I pulled the probe and backed off the ice shelf in a controlled and deliberate way. From shore, I watched the ice surface, featureless. The sound continued for another 30 or 40 seconds, moving outward toward the center of the lake, and then it faded. Sandra returned and found me standing on the bank with my equipment in my hand and no further data collected. She looked at my face and asked what had happened. I told her the ice had been making settling sounds that made me uncomfortable. She accepted that. I went home and spent the evening in the literature. Ice acoustics, subglacial bioacoustics, freshwater sound propagation. I found nothing that accounts for a coherent, rhythmically variable, speech-structured sound source moving directionally under ice in a small, shallow, high-elevation lake. The lake is too small and too shallow to support any known species capable of producing that kind of vocalization. There is no physical mechanism I can identify. I've done 20 winter sampling events since. I haven't heard it again. But every time I work near an ice edge, I watch the surface. Every single time, just in case. Story 6, The Man Who Came for His Hat. My grandfather's name was Rufus Tyndale, and he farmed and ran trap lines his entire life in a holler in Harlan County, Kentucky. He was born in 1933, and he died in 2018. He was the most straightforward man I have ever known, constitutionally incapable of fabrication or exaggeration. Not because he lacked imagination, but because he considered both to be disrespectful to the people he was talking to. He told me one story in his life that he asked me not to repeat while he was living. He was 81 when he told me. My name is Carson Tyndale. My grandfather's gone now. The story deserves to be told. This happened in the fall of 1963, when my grandfather was 30 years old. He was running his trap line in a stretch of forest about 4 miles behind the home property, territory he'd worked since boyhood. Every creek and hollow and ridgeline as familiar to him as the interior of his own house. He'd gone out before first light and was working back toward the house by mid-morning. Nothing unusual about the day. He came around the bend in a hollow trail that he'd walked 100 times, and there was a man sitting on a log. An old man, he said, and very old was the specific phrase he used. with emphasis on both words. The man was wearing clothes that didn't fit the time, a heavy canvas coat of a style that would have been 40 or 50 years out of fashion even in 1963. Thick wool trousers, lace-up boots with hooks. And on the log beside him, a battered, wide-brimmed hat. The man was looking at the ground when my grandfather came around the bend. He raised his eyes when he heard footsteps, and my grandfather said those eyes stopped him before anything else did. They were the wrong color, not the wrong shade of a human color, wrong in a category sense. Gray, he said, but not the gray of an iris. More like the gray of wet limestone or the gray of a winter creek. An inorganic gray. The gray of a thing that does not live. My grandfather said good morning because that was what you did. The old man said good morning back, and his voice was too deep and too resonant, occupying more of the air than a voice should. The man asked if my grandfather had a hat he would be willing to sell. My grandfather said he had only the wool cap he was wearing and didn't have a spare. The old man said he'd lost his hat somewhere on this ridge a long time back and had been trying to replace it, and that he'd been looking for quite a while. My grandfather asked where the man lived, since there was nothing on the other side of that ridge but government timberland for miles, and the old man gestured vaguely up the slope and said he was from just over. Something in the situation was making every quiet alarm in my grandfather's body sound off. Not a sound or a thought, but a physical wrongness that runs through the body when something is not right with what's in front of you. This man didn't register as human in the way that human registers. The way you look at a person and your brain simply sorts them into the category automatically, and this man required active effort to sort, and the sort kept not sticking. He made an excuse, said he had animals that needed tending, and walked away. He did not run. He told me later that not running felt very important, like the situation was one where running would change the parameters of it in a direction that could not be walked back from. He walked at a normal pace and did not look behind him, and went straight to the house. His wife took one look at him and said, "Rufus, you look like you've seen death." He sat at the kitchen table and told her what he'd seen. She went quiet, and then she went to the back room where she kept a cedar box that had belonged to his grandmother, a box of old photographs and papers. She brought it to the table and opened it and took out a photograph. Old, brown and white. 3 men standing in front of a timber operation, posed and stiff. She put it on the table in front of him and pointed to the man on the left without saying anything. My grandfather told me he sat and looked at that photograph for a very long time. The man on the left was the man on the log. The same face, the same build, the same coat, the same everything, down to a scar across the left cheekbone that he hadn't mentioned to his wife, but that she recognized from the photograph she'd grown up seeing. The photograph was dated on the back in faded pencil to approximately 1908. When it was taken, the man would have appeared to be in his 30s or 40s. In 1963, the man on the log had looked to be in his 80s or 90s. But the face was the same face. She told him to stay out of that hollow. He stayed out of it for almost 3 years. When he finally went back, working himself up to it, the log was there. The hat was on the log, sitting exactly where the old man had laid it. My grandfather looked at it from a distance and walked around it and came home and never touched it and never went back. He told me the hat was still there the last time he'd looked, a few years before he died. He said it like a fact he'd made peace with, like weather. I have never gone to look for it. I plan to keep it that way. Story 7. The Congregation. I am 71 years old and my name is Paulette Oakes, and I live in the same small town in southwestern Virginia where I was born, where I raised my children, where my husband Dale is buried. I taught elementary school here for 31 years. I'm telling you what I witnessed in August of 1984 because 40 years have not changed a single detail of it in my memory, and because I believe there is value in the record existing somewhere outside of my own head. My husband and I were driving back from a family funeral in eastern Tennessee. It was late, somewhere around 11 at night, on a 2-lane highway through the mountain country in Virginia. A road I have driven many times before and many times since, and that has never felt entirely comfortable to me in the years after that night. Dale was driving. I was in the passenger seat with the window down because the air conditioning had given out, and even at that hour, the late summer heat was thick and present. We came around a long curve and the headlights moved across a hayfield on the right side of the road, flat and open, maybe 70 or 80 yards deep before it reached a tree line. And there were people in the field, many people, standing. I estimated 50 or more, though my husband thought it could have been as many as 100. They were dressed in dark clothing, not uniformly, but all muted, all dark. And they were arranged in a rough circular formation, all facing inward toward a central point, a center of the circle that was too far from the road for the headlights to illuminate. None of them were moving. The whole configuration was as still as a photograph. Dale said quietly, "What is that?" Not alarmed, just processing. I said I didn't know. We were both looking. The truck had slowed, and then someone on the near edge of the circle turned toward us, not quickly, deliberately. And then the person beside them turned, and then the next, and the next, one by one, around the perimeter of that circle, in both directions simultaneously, like a wave, heads turning toward the road, toward our truck, toward us, until every single person in that field was facing our direction. 50 or 100 people standing in a dark field at 11 at night, in a circle around something I could not see, all having turned in unison to look at two people in a passing truck, in complete silence. Dale accelerated. We drove several miles in silence before I asked if he'd seen it. He said yes. I asked what he thought it was. He said he didn't know and that he wasn't going to talk about it that night. Dale was a straight-backed, practical man who had served in the Army and had never in our 30 years together expressed uncertainty about anything, unless he was genuinely uncertain. The fact that he wouldn't talk about it was the most frightening part of the evening. We researched afterward. No religious congregation, no community organization, no documented tradition of outdoor gathering in that area that could account for what we saw. No permits, no records, nothing. The field is just a field. In daylight, it is entirely ordinary. But I don't drive that road after dark, and I haven't since the late 1980s. Some things you simply stop putting yourself in the path of. That's just wisdom. Story 8. My name is Damon Pruitt. I'm 47, a licensed plumber in Nicholas County, West Virginia. I've been in some unusual situations in the course of my work. Old farmhouses have strange histories, and plumbing problems sometimes reveal things that the people living there would rather not know. I'm breaking my usual discretion here because what I found at a property in a hollow above my county 6 years ago has stayed with me, and I think it should be documented. The property belonged to an older gentleman who lived alone. He called about a secondary drain field that was backing up. I drove up the hollow, met him at the gate. Quiet man, 70 or older, economical with words. He walked me back through his property a quarter mile into the timber behind his garden, and at the top of a rise, he stopped and pointed ahead and said the drain field was just past the big oak. He said his knees couldn't manage the walk down the far side of the rise, and he'd wait. Fine, I went on. I found the outfall pipe and the remnants of the distribution gravel, and then I found the reason for the call. The ground had collapsed. Not the gentle settlement you see with old systems. Collapsed. A sinkhole about 15 feet across and 8 or 10 feet deep at its center, sitting exactly where the distribution trench would have run. Old collapse, clearly. The edges were weathered and vegetated, and the depression had its own small ecosystem of ferns and moss in the shade at the bottom. This had happened a long time ago. I got to the edge and looked down, and the smell hit me. Not the smell I expected, not the sour sulfur of a septic failure, though. that was present underneath it. Something older and heavier, something that had been enclosed somewhere airless for a long time. Something organic, something that smelled the way sealed basements smell, but more concentrated and more wrong. And in the soft earth at the bottom of the sinkhole, covering roughly a 3 by 3 foot area, there were handprints. Not footprints. Handprints. Pressed deep with considerable force. Very large, much larger than my own hands. And when I looked carefully at the impressions, I counted what looked like too many finger channels. The fingers were long, and the number of impressions per hand did not consistently resolve to 5. Running away from the handprint area toward the far wall of the sinkhole, there was a furrow in the soft earth, about 8 inches wide, 2 or 3 inches deep. The channel something makes if it drags itself across a soft surface. The furrow went straight to the far wall, to a section where the earth had pulled away from an underlying shelf of limestone, leaving a gap, maybe 10 inches high and a foot wide at its widest point. Dark inside, cold air coming from it. The smell heavier near the gap than anywhere else in the sinkhole. The furrow went into the gap. I stood there too long. My brain kept offering me explanations, and my eyes kept refusing them. I took photographs. I climbed back out and went to where the old man was waiting at the oak. I showed him the photographs. He looked at them, and then at me, and said, "That's been there since before I bought this place." Even. Not defensive, not alarmed. Like a man who has known something for a long time and made a careful peace with it. And then he said, "I need you to tell me it's a septic issue." I wrote it up as drain field collapse of unknown origin requiring full evaluation and remediation. He never called back. The gap in the limestone is still there. Whatever made the furrow made it from inside the sinkhole going in, not from inside the gap coming out. Whatever it was leaving the space below the limestone and coming up into the world. And the man had been living 4 miles from it for long enough that he knew not to be surprised. Story 9, The Relay Runner. I have been running ultra-distance trail races for 9 years. My name is Vicky Stanowski, and I am 29 and I've competed in races across the Appalachian region, 200 plus nights in the backcountry. I know the mountain forest environment in a way that only comes from accumulated time in it, and I know how my own perceptions function under various conditions. What I'm describing happened in daylight late afternoon on a training run in the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia, during which I was not in any state that would compromise my perception. I have no satisfactory explanation for it. I was 16 miles into a 22-mile solo loop, moving well, a Tuesday afternoon in late summer. I came around a switchback on a descending section of trail, and there was a person ahead of me on the trail, running posture, heading the same direction away from me. I was closing on them. Normal trail encounter. As I got closer, I could see, it was a man, tall and lean, in dark running gear, long sleeves. I called out on your left, the standard, and he moved to the right side of the trail without turning. I passed him on the left, and as I came alongside, I glanced over to nod. His face was wrong, not injured or deformed, wrong in a way I've been trying to put language to for 3 years. He was looking straight ahead, and his face was without expression, in a way that went beyond having a neutral expression. There was no motion in any of the muscle groups that govern facial expression during physical exertion. When you run, your face moves. The small, constant micro-adjustments of expression happen even in a blank face. His face had none of this. It was the face of something that had arranged itself to look like a face, but had not accounted for the small, constant motion of a living face. His eyes did not track me as I passed. His stride was wrong in the same way. Human running gait is a continuous sequence of balance adjustments, small variations in pace and foot placement. the body constantly finding and losing equilibrium. His stride was mechanically identical, from footfall to footfall. No variation, no adjustment. The same motion, perfectly copied, endlessly repeated. I ran faster. I put on a significant surge and looked back after a quarter mile. He was there, same distance behind me as when I'd passed him. Same pace. I ran harder, looked back, same distance. I ran as hard as I was capable of running, the kind of pace that hurts. And I looked back and he was still there, exactly that same distance behind me, running that same flat, perfect, mechanical stride. The trail curved. When I came around the curve and could see back along the straight section, he was gone. I have looked for him. Trail running communities are not large, and the Monongahela section isn't heavily trafficked. I've searched race databases, local running club rosters, every public record I can access. Nobody fitting that description trains in that section of the forest. I still run trails. I run with a group now, and I will not run that forest solo. That wasn't a person who was running. It was something that was running like a person. There is a difference, and I felt it at the cellular level when I looked at that face, practicing, getting better, running that same section until the stride is just right. Story 10. My name is Sandra Birch. I'm a home health aide, 16 years in elder care, mostly in rural communities in the southern Appalachians. I've been in hundreds of old mountain homes in that time. I've sat with people in their final weeks and months, and I've heard a great many things said by people who have no more reason to perform for anyone. There is a particular quality of honesty that comes from the very old and the very ill, and I have learned over my career to pay careful attention to it. My client was a woman I will call Mrs. Fay, 93 years old, living alone in a hand-built cabin 6 miles up a hollow in Robin County, Georgia. Referred by her great-niece, who was out of state and worried but unable to come. When I arrived for my initial visit, Mrs. Fay met me at the door with a deliberate, measuring gaze. She said, "You're not afraid of old things, are you?" I said, "No, ma'am." She said, "Good, because this house has a lot of them." The cabin was dense with the accumulated material of a very long life, and a family that had been on that land for something close to 200 years. Old tools, old photographs, old furniture, a wood stove, a hand-dug root cellar, quilts made by women who had been dead for 80 years. And running along the highest shelves in the main room, circling the perimeter near the ceiling, were mason jars, hundreds of them, old zinc-lidded ones, gone to that particular dull gray of very old metal. The light in the room was low, and I couldn't see their contents clearly from the floor, but they held a dark liquid, almost black, and in each one there was something suspended in it. Small shapes. Mrs. Fay and I developed a genuine rapport over the months I worked with her. She was one of the sharpest people I've ever spent time with, her mind untouched by any of the usual erosions of extreme age, and she had a quality of presence, of genuine authority, that I've encountered in perhaps 3 people in my entire career. Several months in, I asked about the jars. I asked carefully, the way you do when you're not sure whether you're about to learn something interesting or something that will change the way you see a space you've been comfortable in. Mrs. Fay sat with the question for a moment. Then she said they were keeping things. I asked what kind of things. She looked at me the way she'd looked at me on the porch that first day, and she said, things that were called here from the ridge. Things that got into this family over the years and worked their way into the living. She said the old women of her family, going back several generations, had known how to call them up out of a person and put them somewhere they couldn't move from. She said each jar held one. She said as long as the lid stayed sealed, it stayed in there. I asked what happened if a lid came loose. She said it was why the shelves were built so high, so no one could accidentally dislodge one. And then she said the thing I've thought about almost every day since. She said that when she died, when there was no one left who carried the knowledge, those jars were going to have to stay exactly where they were. She'd left instructions with her great niece. She said the great niece thought she was a foolish old woman and that this kept her awake at night. I asked her once directly what was in the jars. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, something that went looking in the dark and found its way into my grandmother, and then into my grandmother's daughter, and so on down the line, one in each generation, until the women in this family learned to catch them before they could settle. She said the hollow drew them. The jars were the only thing between that hollow and what those things would do if they were free. Mrs. Fay died 8 months into my time with her, peacefully. Her great niece came from out of state to clear the cabin. I was there for the transition. I watched the great niece's eyes go to the jars, and I saw her deciding they were clutter to be cleared. The accumulation of a superstitious old woman. I told her what Mrs. Fay had told me. The great niece smiled carefully and said that Fay had been a character her whole life. She reached for the lowest jar, standing on a step stool she'd brought in. I put my hand on her arm. I said, please, just leave them. Please. She looked at me and something in my face made her step down. The jars are still in that cabin. The property has been on the market for over a year and hasn't sold. I think about Mrs. Fay spending 93 years in that hollow, managing what was on those shelves, keeping the lids sealed, carrying that responsibility for generations worth of trapped things. She was one of the strongest people I've ever known. I didn't understand the full measure of that strength until I understood what she'd been holding back. Story 11. I've been deer hunting since I was old enough to carry a rifle in western North Carolina. My name is Walt Ferris. I'm 54, and I've hunted the same county and the surrounding national forest land for most of my adult life. I know those mountains. I know what lives in them and what sounds they make and when something is wrong. What I'm describing happened 2 hunting seasons ago in the Nantahala National Forest. I hunt with a dog. A blackmouth cur named Pepper, who is 7 years old, the finest trained dog I've ever worked with. Steady and fearless, and absolutely reliable in terrain, and weather that would make a lesser animal quit. She has never balked at rough ground or cold water or darkness. She has never shied from a bear or a boar. She is, in the genuine sense of the word, a brave animal, and her steadiness is so consistent that her behavior serves as a reliable instrument for reading the environment around us. This particular morning, we went in before first light and worked a ridge above a persimmon flat. By mid-morning, we hadn't moved anything, and I decided to push lower into a drainage below the ridge. A hollow I've been into many times, good creek in the bottom, good deer country. Pepper stopped at the top of the descent, just stopped and would not go on. This dog planted herself at the edge of the descent and refused the hollow, and she was shaking. Not a cold weather shiver, not the excitement tremble before a chase. A full body shake from her shoulders down through her flanks. The shake of an animal whose adrenal system has fully engaged in response to a serious threat. She pressed against my leg, which she does not do in the field, which I have never in 6 years seen her do in the field, and her hackles were raised from the base of her skull to the root of her tail, and her ears were flat and her eyes were fixed on the timber below us. I stood with her and listened. The hollow was too quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of cold, still weather. The wrong quiet, the quiet that says the birds know something and have gone still, and the squirrels know something and have gone still, and even the small, constant rustling of the leaf litter has stopped. The quiet that the mountain produces when something is in those woods that the mountain doesn't have a normal category for. And then from the bottom of the hollow, from the dense laurel thicket along the creek, something spoke. I will not call it an animal sound because it was not one. I will not call it a human voice because it was not that either. It was in the register and the cadence of language, a repeating low vocalization with the structure of speech, the rhythm of words, organized and intentional. in a frequency below what I could assign to any voice I've heard. Stationary. Down there in the laurel, in cover I couldn't see through from where we stood. Pepper sat down. She sat down and she turned her face away from the hollow, away from the timber and the creek and the sound. She would not look at it. This dog that will press into a thicket after a wounded bear sat down and turned her face away from whatever was in the bottom of that hollow. I turned us around and we moved off that ridge. Controlled, not running, but moving with intention. We got to the truck and I checked Pepper over for injuries because she'd been shaking the whole walkout. She was physically fine. She ate that evening and slept normally and was herself the next morning. But when I started gathering my gear the following morning, she flinched at the sight of my hunting vest. First time in her life. I've been back in those mountains many times since. I won't go back into that hollow. Pepper won't either, and since she can smell whatever's down there from the ridgeline above it, I've been taking her lead. She knows. She turned her face away from it. That's enough of a verdict for me. Story 12. I'm 29 years old and I section hike the Appalachian Trail. My name is Joey Carlin, and I've been doing this since I was 24, working through sections of the trail as time and finances permit, accumulating close to 200 nights in the backcountry across 5 years. I've shared shelters with strangers in the rain, hiked in the dark when my timeline required it, been through lightning on exposed ridges in the Roan Highlands, and bear activity in the Smokies. I don't consider myself fearful of the backcountry. This is the only experience I've had on the trail that I can't account for. It was mid-September, Virginia section of the AT 2 years ago. Close to 18 miles that day, and I stopped at Elk Garden Shelter as the light was failing. Another hiker was there, a northbound through hiker named Todd, who'd been on trail since Georgia in March. The kind of person you meet in Virginia and immediately recognizes someone thoroughly shaped by 6 months of trail life. We cooked, talked, were in our bags by 9. Completely ordinary shelter night. I woke somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning. I lay still for a moment the way you do when you're a light sleeper and wake suddenly. Todd was asleep on the far end of the platform. The shelter was dark and cold and quiet. And then I heard what had woken me. Outside the open face of the shelter, beyond the fire ring, in the dark, breathing. Slow, very controlled, very even. Not bear breathing, not animal breathing. The breathing of something that was specifically controlling its breath, the careful metered respiration of something that understood its breath, could be heard, and was managing it deliberately. And then a shape moved into the open face of the shelter, into the area where the firelight would have reached if there had been a fire. Just beyond that boundary, staying in the darkness at the edge of the opening. Large, upright, completely still, I could not see a face or any detail of features. Just a shape, dense and present in the darkness, with proportions that were approximately human but wrong in several dimensions. Too wide through the shoulders, too tall in relation to those shoulders, standing with an absolute stillness that no person manages. The stillness of something that has decided to hold motionless and can do so without the small, constant movements a standing human body makes to maintain balance. It stood there. It breathed. It did not approach. It did not retreat. The fire ring was between it and the platform, and it stayed on the far side of that empty ring, in the dark, just at the line of the shelter opening, and I lay there watching it without any ability to form a clear intention. My body had made a decision that I was not going to move. We stayed like that for a time I could not measure. And then Todd shifted in his sleeping bag, one of those unconscious repositioning movements a sleeper makes without waking, and the shape was gone. Not stepping away, not retreating. In the span of the half second I was tracking Todd's movement, it ceased to be there. I lay awake until full light, broke camp quietly and early, moved fast all day. In the flat stretches and the long descents, I kept returning to the shape and the opening of the shelter, the stillness of it. It had positioned itself where it could observe and had selected the boundary of the dark for that position. And the combination told me that whatever it was had done something like this before. It knew how to do what it was doing. Whatever it was, it had learned the optimal position for watching at a backcountry shelter. It was getting better at being a visitor. I've been back on the AT since. I don't stop at that shelter. I've given a few others in that section a wide berth too. Something about the air around them that reminds me of that stillness. You learn things in the backcountry that don't translate to words. You just know certain places and you walk through them fast, and you're grateful when you're past. I want to pause here and ask you something. If you're someone who spends nights in the backcountry, who has felt that stillness, who has heard something answer that shouldn't have answered, I need you in the comments right now. This community is building something real, and your experience matters to it. Comment below, hit that like button. And if you've been watching for a while without subscribing, now is the time. Now, the final 3. Story 13, the one who looked like my brother. My name is Catherine Sewell, and I'm 35 years old and I live in eastern Tennessee. My younger brother Danny was killed in a car accident in 2016. He was 22 years old, and he was the kind of person who fills up every room he walks into, and I have thought about him every day since he died. I want you to understand from the start that I'm not a person who looks for supernatural explanations. I have been in therapy consistently since Danny died, and I have a clear and practiced understanding of how grief affects perception. I have a very good therapist who has offered me a cogent interpretation of what I'm about to describe. I respect that interpretation. I don't fully believe it. This happened in August of 2021. I had decided, on the advice of that therapist and with the encouragement of the work we'd done together over 5 years, to return to the Cherokee National Forest, specifically to a trail that Danny and I had hiked together many times. I drove out to the trailhead on a weekday morning and started up. The first 2 hours were what I'd hoped for. Difficult, but in the right way. The kind of emotion that moves through you rather than stopping you. I sat at our old overlook, cried a little, ate my lunch, and thought about Danny, and it felt appropriate. And then I started back down. About a mile from the trailhead on a section of trail through a stand of hardwoods, I saw someone ahead of me. A young man moving away from me in the downhill direction, medium height, brown hair. From behind, and everything in my body seized. Because from behind it was Danny, not resembling Danny, being Danny. The height, the build, the particular asymmetry of his walk, the way his left shoulder always sat fractionally lower than his right. A thing you would only notice if you had watched that person walk away from you 1,000 times in 1,000 different contexts. My legs kept moving, and I was crying before I'd made any conscious decision to cry. And then he turned his head. Just a quarter turn, the way you turn when you think you've heard something off the trail. I could see the profile, and I stopped walking because it wasn't Danny. Danny is dead and buried and has been for 5 years. I stood there and let my nervous system settle, and I went through the rational accounting. Similar build, similar hair, a similar gait. That grief was amplifying into an exact match, because that's what grief does. I know how perception works. I know how grief warps it. I let the moment pass, and then I started walking again. He was still ahead of me, still the same distance. And I watched his walk as I followed, and the similarity didn't dim with the analytical attention I was giving it. It held. The left shoulder, the specific heel strike of his left foot. Private, intimate knowledge of a person's body that belongs only to the people who love them. I sped up. I wanted to see the face and close this out. As I sped up, he sped up, exactly matched my increase in pace without turning or appearing to track my movement at all. I slowed to a near stop. He slowed to a near stop. I moved again. He moved again, not following me, moving with me. Maintaining the exact same distance through every change in my pace with a precision that is not possible for a coincidentally similar-looking stranger to reproduce. I stopped entirely and stood still on the trail, and slowly he turned around. The features were right. Danny's face, the specific arrangement of it, the jaw and the nose and the eyes, but wrong in the way that a reproduction is wrong. The components correct, the thing they add up to not quite right, too still, too arranged. The face of something that had assembled Danny's face from some store of information it had about Danny, and had gotten the pieces right, but had missed something essential about the way those pieces move in life. The small, constant animation of a living face that cannot be cataloged, because it emerges from something that cannot be cataloged. And it was looking at me, and it smiled. Not Danny's smile. A thing that knew a smile should go there and had placed one there. And then it stepped off the trail into the forest, and I heard the leaves under its feet for a moment, and then nothing. I have discussed this event many times with my therapist. She has given me a sophisticated and compassionate account of dissociative grief response. She is probably right, but she wasn't on that trail. She didn't see what I saw when that thing turned around. She didn't see it hold exactly my pace through every change. She didn't see it smile with something that knew where a smile should go, but didn't know what smiling meant. I'm going back to that trail someday. I'm just going to make sure I'm ready first. Story 14. My name is Elvin Rakes. I'm 66 years old and I have lived in Grayson County, Virginia my entire life. My father was born here, his father and grandfather before him. We are people of this ground in the old sense, formed by it, shaped by its knowledge and its limits, carrying forward an understanding of this place that was built over generations. I want you to hold that context when you read what I'm about to say, because the knowledge I'm describing is not the knowledge of someone who read something or heard a story at a distance. It is the knowledge that lives in a family and a community that has inhabited a specific piece of mountain country for 200 years. There is a road in the mountains above my county that doesn't appear on any map. I have known where it is since my father pointed it out to me when I was approximately 10 years old and told me in simple, serious terms, never to take it. It starts at a break in the tree line on the eastern face of a ridge above the county road, a gap that looks from the outside like the beginning of a logging road or an old farm access. Two worn ruts in the earth with grass growing up the center stripe, exactly the kind of unmarked track you see scattered all through these mountains and think nothing of. My father told me it went somewhere that was not where it appeared to go. He told me that people who walked or drove down it sometimes didn't come back, and that others came back changed in ways he described only as wrong and left it at that. He'd grown up hearing this from his own father. The knowledge of that road is older than anyone living. In 30 years of driving the county road that passes its opening, I've looked at that break in the trees maybe 500 times. It never looks like anything. It looks like exactly what it appears to be, a gap in a tree line, modest and unremarkable. That is part of what makes it what it is, I think. In the spring of 1989, a friend of mine named Gary Setliff, originally from Ohio, transplanted to our county through a job and a marriage, spotted the road from my truck as we drove past. Gary was a good man, but he was from elsewhere, and he had the elsewhere person's comfortable skepticism about the things that people from here know. He asked about the gap, and I told him, the honest version of it, what my father told me, what his father told him. Gary listened with the careful respect of someone who doesn't believe what he's hearing, but cares enough about the teller to hear it fully. And then he said he'd like to see where it went. I parked at the gap and told him I wasn't going with him. He could see I wasn't joking, and I think it gave him some pause, but not enough. He got out and went up the road into the trees. I waited on the county road for 20 minutes, and then I drove home. Called his wife that evening. She said he'd come back. She said he'd come home and gone straight to bed, hadn't spoken, hadn't eaten. She said his eyes were wrong. Distant, she said. Like he was still somewhere else, and his body had come back without the rest of him. Gary normalized over 3 or 4 days. He was himself again. The Ohio warmth and the good humor, and if I'd been observing him cold without the context, I might have thought he'd had a rough week and recovered. He never spoke to me about what he'd seen on that road, not once. I tried once, carefully, a few months later, and he closed it the way you close a door on a room that has something in it you don't want to look at. Not hostile, just fast and final. Gary moved back to Ohio in 1993, and we kept Christmas cards for a few years after. I don't know where he is now. I don't know who he told or whether he told anyone. I know that he went up that road for 20 minutes, and he came back with something missing from his eyes and never fully talked about it again. The gap is still in the tree line. I drive past it twice a month. I look at it for approximately 2 seconds when I pass, and then I look at the road in front of me. My son asked me about it a few years back, noticed me looking, asked what I was watching for. I told him what my father told me. He's from this ground, same as I am. He understood without needing more than that. Story 15. I am a graduate student in ecology, 27 years old, and I've been conducting field research in the Appalachian mountain systems of Virginia and West Virginia for the past 4 years. My name is Nora Clement. I grew up in suburban Maryland and came to the mountains through my academic work, not through any family connection to the region. And I want to be honest about that because it determines how I processed what happened and why I'm sharing it the way I'm sharing it. I came to this landscape with a full set of scientific tools and a comfort with those tools and a trust in them. That comfort has not fully recovered. I do owl survey work as part of my research. It involves going into the forest at specific predetermined survey stations at night, broadcasting recorded calls of the target species through a playback speaker and listening and recording for responses. Methodical, protocols-driven work that requires standing still in the dark and being as quiet and attentive as possible for extended periods. I've done several hundred survey points across my time in the field, and I have a well-developed catalog for the sounds of the nighttime Appalachian forest. I know what each owl species sounds like. I know the sounds that get mistaken for owls. I know the sounds that are just the forest being itself. What I encountered at a survey point in the George Washington National Forest in Virginia in March, 3 years ago, does not match anything in that catalog. It was a clear, cold night in early March, around 2 in the morning, on a ridge in a section of the forest I had surveyed several times before without incident. I played the northern saw-whet owl call sequence, the standard rotation of the advertising call, and I stood with my data recorder and my clipboard, and I waited. 30 seconds of playback, 3 minutes of listening. Standard protocol. And something answered. The response came from the tree line to the north of my station, approximately 40 yards out, roughly where a territory holding saw-whet might respond from. For the first moment of hearing it, part of my brain was running it through the saw-whet template and finding approximate matches. The basic tonal structure was there, the repetitive series of notes in the right general frequency range. I had my recorder running and was already noting the response in the data column. And then the match started to fail. The interval between notes was slightly too long, just outside the normal range but consistently, precisely outside it. Not in the way a recording artifact or atmospheric distortion would produce, but in the way something would produce it, if it had learned the pattern, but not quite perfectly. The pitch was slightly too low across the whole call, again consistently, in a way that suggested something with a slightly larger resonating structure than a saw-whet's vocal apparatus. And underneath the call, running beneath it like a second layer, a harmonic depth, that I have no biological analog for, a complexity in the frequency structure that the software later flagged as anomalous, resembling the harmonic signature of a mechanical source rather than a biological one. The response called 3 more times with that same almost right quality and then went silent. I recorded all of it. I moved to the next station and completed my survey and drove back to the university and told myself I had heard an unusual individual, possibly a juvenile, possibly an atypical individual. I have heard atypical individuals before. That's what I told myself. The spectral analysis disagreed. The frequency profile of my recording didn't match saw-whet owl vocalizations at any developmental stage. It didn't match any known bird species in the Appalachian avifauna. The harmonic structure was flagged as mechanically complex in a way that required explanation. I played it for 3 colleagues without providing context. 2 of them heard an owl. The third was my department's most experienced field ornithologist, 30 years in the Appalachian region. He listened to it twice. He looked at me and said, "Where did you record this?" I told him. He said, "Have you been back to that station?" I said, "Yes, twice, nothing unusual on either return." He said, "Just be aware." He wouldn't say more than that. I've asked him about it twice since, and he deflects, not unkindly, but with a completeness that tells me he's not going to discuss it. I've been doing this work for 4 years, and I have never seen him respond to an unusual recording that way. Something in those trees heard a call in the dark and knew enough to answer with almost the right sound. Almost. Not perfectly. The imperfection seems important. Something that has learned to respond but has not quite gotten the frequency right, not quite gotten the timing right, getting closer, perhaps, over time. Learning what the correct sound is supposed to be. Practicing in the dark of the George Washington National Forest. Calling back at people who stand in the dark and play recordings and wait. I don't know what to do with that conclusion, and I don't pursue it further than that, but I keep the recorder running at every station now. And every time I stand in the dark and play a call and wait, I am very aware of what it means to be heard by something that's been practicing how to sound like it belongs. If you've made it to the end of this video and you're not subscribed yet, do it right now. Hit subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new upload. This channel drops new content every week, and every video is built on accounts like these. Real people, real experiences, real places you can find on a map. Drop a comment before you leave tonight. Tell me which story got under your skin the most. Tell me where you're from. Tell me if any of these locations are in your backyard. Tell me if you've heard something answer back in the dark in those mountains, or seen something move through the trees that moved wrong. The comments on this channel are where this community lives and breathes, and I want to hear from you. If you want to go deeper, the membership is open. Hit that join button below the video. Members get early access to every new upload, full-length bonus compilations that never go public, and a direct pipeline to submit your own account for possible feature on the channel. The membership is what makes this channel sustainable, and I genuinely could not do this without the people who've chosen to support it. If you've been on the fence, tonight is the night. And before you close this window, share it. Send this video to one person who spends time outdoors, one person who has a story they've been holding on to, one person who you know would understand what these accounts mean. These stories deserve to be heard, and the only way they reach the people who need to hear them is if you help carry them forward. These mountains keep their secrets for a long time, but some of them get out, and when they do, this is where they come. Park Ranger Files. Same time next week.